Hey guys, tonight we're cracking open a frothy barrel of historical weirdness. Victorian babies on beer. Not craft brew, not artisanal IPAs, just pure, old-school baby brewskis. Straight from the bottle to the bottle, if you catch my drift. This is the era of horse-drawn carriages, top hats, and apparently infants who could probably outdrink your Uncle Gary at Thanksgiving. So, before we start soaking our pacifiers in Pilsner, do me a favour and tap subscribe, click like, and leave a comment to tell me which 19th century beverage would best replace your morning coffee. But only if you actually enjoy this strange little corner of YouTube. Now turn down the lights, crank up the gentle hum of your bedside fan, and nestle under that blanket, like you're hiding from your responsibilities. Let's do a quick roll call. Did you ever wonder what it felt like to be a baby in an age where sleeping through the night probably meant a beer nap? Why did parents think alcohol was the secret recipe for a healthy, happy child? How did toddlers handle hangovers before Pedialyte? What happens when your teething ring doubles as an ale stein? Were Victorian diapers the original beer coasters? And, most importantly, could you survive childhood in an era where your bedtime snack was a pint of mild ale and a biscuit hard enough to chip a tooth? Congratulations. You've just woken up in 1842. You're wearing a flannel nightgown. Your teething toy tastes suspiciously hoppy, and your biggest worry isn't nap time. It's last call. The sun creeps in through heavy velvet curtains as your eyes snap open. Not because you're refreshed, but because the neighbour's rooster is drunk and crowing jazz standards. Breakfast is a bowl of porridge so thick you'll need an ice pick, and right beside it, a mug of something malty, light, and undeniably alcoholic. Welcome to your first taste of infant strength beer, and yes, they really called it that. In the murky hours of early modern England, this was less an eccentric lifestyle choice than a daily act of survival. The water bobbling through the pipes, if your home had pipes at all, couldn't be trusted. Parasites, filth, the casual corpse, or worse, a dash of someone else's discarded experiment with leather tanning. The rivers held mysteries best left undrunk. Boiling water was fiddly, time-consuming, reserved for the sick or the odd cup of penny-royal tea. But beer was reliable. Beer was safe. Even the stuff so low in alcohol that yes, babies could drink it, had the virtue of being boiled, brewed, and blessedly bug-free. Your first sips of the day, barely more potent than today's sugary cola, come more from habit and hygiene than from hedonism. Laxly supervised children, hunched over wooden bowls, slurp it with their grainy mush, while parents debate the day's business with mugs clasped in both hands. It's not unusual to see a potboy weaving down the lane with a cart stacked with frothing jugs, distributing the morning's fresh brew like the world's least practical milkman. But here's the real twist. Nobody blinked at this routine. Ale, beer, small beer. It was everywhere, in every home, all day, for everyone. This wasn't about merriment. It was about necessity. Water sat, inviting dysentery. Beer sparkled with the promise of another day without intestinal adventure. From the manor houses to the simplest hovels, the ritual was the same. Pour, sip, carry on. The beer itself was a far cry from the hop-forward IPAs or syrupy stouts of your local taproom. Early morning brews used small beer, usually 1–2% alcohol, little bitterness, faintly sweet, sometimes cloudy, always nourishing. Brewed from the last run-through of the malt, it was an afterthought, a residue of greater, feistier ales meant for the feast or the harvest. Some households had a dedicated alewife. And yes, she could make or break a marriage. Bad beer could turn neighbours into enemies faster than you could say scandal at the wellhead. Kitchen life revolved around brewing. Massive cauldrons muttered on the fire. Malt fragrances, rich and yeasty, floated over the breakfast table. Leftover grains made their way into pottage, or to the chickens if they weren't drunk already. Beer was community glue. Everyone drank it, shared it, and trusted it to contain the less visible threats of ordinary life. Of course, there were outliers. Some clever souls infused their breakfast beer with a dash of rosemary or a splash of stale wine. Others tinkered with oats, wheat, or the rare luxury of spices. Experimentation born as much from necessity, what's left in the larder, as from the pursuit of a tastier morning mug. Imagine it, a bleary-eyed procession filtering past your window, each cradling their own tankard, each mumbling variations on the same hope. Let the worm stay far, the bowels stay calm, and the alewife's hand be steady. It's not a scene built for Instagram, but it's the scaffolding of survival, the dawn ritual that underpinned 1,000 quiet days. So, yes, your day begins with a spoon fighting through porridge and a toast to the beer that, for centuries, kept Britain bobbing along, not tipsy, but triumphantly, cautiously, alive. Before Brita filters, before Evian, there was the Dirty Thames Special. And that's not a craft cocktail, that's just the water. If you want to avoid 6 weeks of existential diarrhea, the adult in your life will give you ale. It's mildly alcoholic, but in these parts, that's considered medicinal. The reality of daily drinking water in medieval cities staggered somewhere between a bad dare and a game of pathogen roulette. The River Thames, for instance, was less a shimmering stream and more a liquid landfill. Doppelgangers for lost chamber pots and a mobile habitat for everything that had nowhere better to go. The collective wisdom was simple. If it didn't bubble and fizz, like ale, you probably shouldn't drink it. This is not because people enjoyed being tipsy all day, although, admit it, some probably did. It was a survival protocol masquerading as happy hour. Picture yourself in 14th century London. You're thirsty. Maybe you just came in from the fields or finished a muggy walk across London Bridge. Do you reach for a refreshing dipperful of Thames water, with its artisanal bouquet of typhus, cholera, and the occasional suspicious floaty? Or do you opt for small beer, a weak ale brewed at home or in the local alehouse, mild in alcohol but strong in life-preserving properties, because the brewing process boiled the water, killing off most of the nasties? Choices. Choices. This, by the way, was an intergenerational institution. Kids, elders, merchants, and even monks partook. We're not talking about drunken town criers and school kids sloshed on lunch break. Small beer was about as alcoholic as a modern kombucha, and considerably safer than the alternatives. In fact, rationing ale to children was seen as an act of parental prudence. It was not only encouraged, it was, at least for those who could afford it, expected. It's one of history's lesser-known ironies. In a bewildering reversal of modern custom, you might get chastised for drinking water instead of beer at breakfast. It's tempting to romanticize this, to imagine everyone wobbling happily through foggy streets. But the reality wasn't nearly as tipsy. Small beer was barely enough to get a mouse tipsy, let alone an adult. The point was hydration and safety, not daytime rave culture. There were, of course, those who overindulged with the higher octane stuff. But on the whole, ordinary daily drinking was a matter of survival. And it wasn't only a matter of practicality. Beer found its way into the cadence of daily life and culture. Poets gave it nods. Physicians wrote treatises about its health benefits. Granted, the bar was low, didn't kill you immediately, counted as a fierce endorsement. Taxes were levied, riots provoked, and even religious holidays measured out in tankards. In taverns and markets, the simple act of sharing a round of ale was as social as it was sanitary. But beyond all this communal cheer, the perils of water were never far from mind. Epidemics frequently swept through cities, and those who took their chances with unboiled river water paid a steep and often fatal price. People quickly learned to spot the difference between sparkling clarity and deadly deceit in their drinking cups. And don't drink the water wasn't just visitor advice, it was a community-wide mantra. And so, beer didn't just fill mugs, it filled a critical role in medieval urban survival. Amid the raucous toasts and foamy moustaches, there was an ever-present undercurrent of caution, a lived wisdom that sometimes staying sober was the riskier choice. In today's world, we can laugh at the idea of preschoolers sipping pints, but in the treacherous landscape of medieval hygiene, beer wasn't a luxury or a vice. It was, quite literally, the drink of life. Let me know if you'd like further tweaks or additional material for adjacent sections. Your crib is hand-carved, quaint, and features a small wooden bottle holder. What, did you think sippy cups were a modern invention? Lullabies here are sung by parents who slur the words a little and smell like brew pubs. It's cosy, in its own way. Let's set the scene. It's a foggy London evening. Maybe there's the gentle sound of horse hooves clip-clopping on wet cobblestones outside. Your nursery is a tight little nook, heavy with the scent of wood smoke, hops, and what we'll politely call old-timey hygiene practices. The wallpaper features faded pastoral scenes and, of course, the odd, mysterious stain. Never you mind about that. The routine in this drunk crib is, well, unique. Daytime means sunbeams dust the room through tiny, leaded windows, while your parents enjoy a refreshing restorative. Gin or ale, poured generously, as was Victorian custom. Your cries rarely worry them. After all, a robust set of lungs is a sign of good health. And who can blame them for being just a little blurry on the lyrics to Rock-a-Bye Baby after the third round of bolsterous toasts to Queen Victoria? The truth is, alcohol was an all-too familiar figure in the Victorian home. Water wasn't always clean or safe, so what's a parent to do except rely on the local brew, sometimes even for the children? Back then, a little nip in the bottle was less child abuse and more everyone does it. Baby colic? A teaspoon of port wine, they'd say, and don't skimp on the sherry. Teething pains. A dab of gin on the gums was the go-to remedy, meant to dull the aches for both child and parent. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Rewind to bedtime. Here, lullabies blend with the gentle rattle of a half-empty pint on a nightstand. Your Victorian parents, swirling and swaying in candlelight, attempt to tuck you in with a song from their own childhood. They may lose their place in the chorus, but where memory fails, enthusiasm prevails. Yes, it's true. Your first lullabies may have sounded more like pub sing-alongs than bedtime croons. Maybe that's why you grow up with such excellent timing. Of course, there's love and laughter here. Your parents have the rosiest of cheeks and sometimes break into spontaneous waltzes right in the nursery. Not always the most stable of pursuits, especially after midnight. But their affections are unchecked and plentiful. You're their pride and joy, and the cause of many an extra celebratory cheers. Let's not sugarcoat it. Life in the drunk crib comes with pitfalls. Occasionally, the bottle holder is mistaken for your baby rattle, and there's the slight risk that you might borrow the wrong beverage. But all things considered, the general chaos is strangely comforting. You don't need to understand the words to their slurred songs to feel the intent. Reassurance, safety, and belonging. Some nights, when sleep proves evasive, you're rocked not by gentle hands, but the rhythmic sway of the house itself, thanks to songs drifting up from the laughter-filled parlour below. In these moments, there's a feeling that you are part of something larger and boisterous, something spirited, in every sense of the word. As you drift off, the sounds blur into a symphony. The ticking of the mantel clock, the crackle of fire, snippets of laughter, the soft clink of a glass. In this Victorian nursery, the line between celebration and routine blurs. Here, comfort is found in ritual, in laughter, and yes, in a little gentle inebriation. And so you grow, lulled not just by lullabies, but by the ongoing pageant of Victorian domestic life, where toasts and tucks go hand in hand, and a baby's crib is as likely to smell of hops as it is of lavender. It's a time and place where everyone, grown and growing, might just stagger a little together on the path to morning. Victorian recipe books are packed with tonics for babies, including beer, patent medicines, gin drops, and, just for that authentic British taste, a hint of laudanum. You'd think the goal is to raise a baby, not season a brisket. It's easy to imagine a harried Victorian mother, teetering on the brink of a nervous collapse, rifling through her pantry like a desperate contestant on a gothic episode of Chopped. Today, she might debate the merits of organic gripe water. But back then, her options were more spirited. Open the family medical book, and you'd find recipes with names like Soothing Draught, Peacemaker's Syrup, and my personal favourite, the Quiet Child Elixir. The main ingredient is always something you wouldn't let near a modern child, unless you want your next playdate to feature hallucinations and a nap that lasts until Tuesday. Consider Mrs. Beeton's Soothing Syrup, which usually started with a few ounces of sherry, a spoonful of honey, and, for that special after-dinner kick, a couple of drops of laudanum. To ensure the tot could truly sleep through anything, many recipes added opium, morphine, or, if you'd run out of classier options, a dram of gin. These days, you'd sooner see these ingredients on a list of controlled substances than on a page adorned with lilacs and polite Victorian fonts. But the Victorians, ever resourceful, didn't stop at opiates. There was also Thomas's infant carminative, a patent medicine marketed with wild claims and enough alcohol content to fuel an afternoon tipsy at the cricket grounds. Mothers were assured their fretful babies would stop crying, which is technically true. Sedation works wonders for colic, teething, and all forms of inconvenient consciousness. Of course, side effects, like permanent confusion or that unfortunate tendency to become a 19th century poet, were considered minor details. Not all recipes were doled out in a lovingly written family cookbook either. Many came bottled and branded, sold by travelling salesmen with the medical ethics of a raccoon in a bakery. Godfrey's cordial, for example, promised to calm even the most restless child. Once administered, the result was unmistakable tranquility, which is what happens when your digestive system is awash with opium and treacle. It's worth pausing here to acknowledge the motivation behind all this. Victorian mothers didn't want to harm their children. They were, like so many parents, just exhausted. Days began at dawn, chores multiplied by the hour, and childcare happened in the gaps between laundry, sewing, and trying not to set oneself on fire with whale oil lamps. Who wouldn't be tempted by a soothing syrup that brought a blessed spell of peace and quiet, allowing mum a moment to patch her sanity, or maybe just a corset? Of course, these chill-out cocktails for cherubs were widely recommended by authority figures. Revered doctors, men with eyebrows like small woodland creatures, endorsed them. No one questioned why sleeping like a baby started to mean unconscious for 12 hours and waking up cross-eyed. The modern equivalent, maybe all those online parenting forums where advice ranges from sensible to just let your child run wild and join a wolf pack. By today's standards, the Victorian nursery reads like a fever dream from a pharmacy's darkest timeline. But through the hazy lens of nostalgia and sleep deprivation, These concoctions offered a warped form of love, laced with a powerful desire for quiet. If you ever wondered where the phrase "mother's little helper" came from, now you know. It wasn't just a Rolling Stones song. It was practically a generational mission statement. Why did parents trust beer more than water? Because the tap water could double as a bacterial zoo. Here, beer's brewing process actually made it the safest drink in the house. Unless you count the milk, which is also unpasteurized. But let's put ourselves in those wooden shoes for a minute. The river out back, not a scenic babbling brook, but a swirling broth of, why is it brown? Washrooms didn't exist as we know them, and if you wanted clean water, well, you and everyone else in town were in for disappointment. It didn't matter if you were a farmhand or royalty, clear, drinkable water was a rare prize, and the average family's water jug was less a holy grail and more a roulette wheel for who got sick next. And that sickness wasn't just an inconvenience. Diarrhea, cholera, dysentery, these weren't the punchlines of history jokes, they were the constant background drumbeat of everyday life. Imagine being a child in a small, candlelit kitchen, watching water bubble over the fire, hoping it'd boil long enough to kill whatever was lurking unseen. Even then, small hands sneaking scoops before the boil could lead to a stomachache that might not go away. Parents weren't being irresponsible. They were simply stuck in a world where the best option was often the lesser evil. Enter beer, the unlikely hero. Thanks to boiling during the brewing process and the natural disinfectant property of alcohol, beer kept most microbes at bay. It was less about getting a buzz and more about not getting ill. Small beer, weak enough for breakfast, fueled entire households, with children filling their mugs before heading to the fields. It sounds reckless today, but consider the trade-off. A low alcohol beverage versus a high risk of illness. The choice wasn't about taste or tradition. It was about survival. And then there was the other danger in a jug: milk. If beer was the hero, milk could easily play the villain. With no refrigeration and no pasteurization, fresh milk was a ticking time bomb. Milking in the morning meant a race against the sun, with spoilage and bacterial growth hot on your heels. Sour milk wasn't a flavor profile. It was a warning to anyone brave or desperate enough to taste it. Families developed a sixth sense about the line between safe and oh no, and more creative uses for sour milk than you'd find in a modern experimental kitchen. Still, solutions were as diverse as they were desperate. Some families buried jugs in cold ground or lowered them into wells. Others dosed water with vinegar or herbs, hoping for a miracle in every mouthful. Water was mixed with everything from honey to wine in a kind of ongoing chemistry. Experiment, each sip a calculated risk. Even communal wells, supposedly cleaner, were only as good as the most recent visitor's hygiene, or lack thereof. What does all this tell us? Above all, that daily life was a continuous negotiation with invisible threats. Now we glance at a glass of tap water with barely a thought, but for centuries, each swallow was an act of courage, even defiance. No wonder beer became a cornerstone of meals, and milk required a leap of faith. So next time you lift a glass, whether of water, beer, or milk, remember the generations who didn't have the luxury of trust. The water jug, innocently sitting on the table, held more than refreshment. It held the story of a society battling for its health, one sip at a time. Let me know if you'd like further adjustments, or if you'd like me to integrate more examples, storytelling techniques, or specific anecdotes. Teething rings? Try a linen cloth dipped in beer. It's soothing, numbing, and prepares you for a lifetime of odd family traditions. Today's mums use frozen carrots. Victorian mums preferred a gentle buzz. If you picture a cranky Victorian baby, red-cheeked and drooling, you'd be correct. Teething was just as fraught in the 1800s as it is today, but the array of parental solutions would turn a modern pediatrician pale. In households from London to Liverpool, the approach was simple. Whatever dulled the pain and preserved some adult sanity was fair game. The list of teething aids reads like a Victorian apothecary's shopping trip gone off the rails. Beyond beer-dipped linen came bread crusts, hardened overnight, pressed into impatient fists and gnawed to mush. For wealthier families, the coral and bells teether, a whimsical silver rattle with an attached chunk of bright red Mediterranean coral, was all the rage. Coral was thought to ward off evil spirits and soothe swollen gums, though it would probably earn a recall notice today for contains sharp edges, high risk of tetanus. Not all remedies were gentle or safe. 19th century medicine cabinets were stocked with soothing syrups, boasting ingredients like opium, morphine, and alcohol, delivered in cheery glass bottles with florid script. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup promised sleep, and perhaps a touch of respiratory depression, freely doled out by desperate caregivers. For working-class families, often juggling a brood of children and little respite, this elixir was sold as a godsend at every corner shop. In hindsight, it's easy to grimace, but context is everything. Victorian parents, lacking antibiotics or reliable anesthesia, leaned heavily on any relief they could find. Yet, some household guides took a gentler approach, recommending simple, tactile comforts. Chilled spoons, knotted muslin, or a dab of honey on a wooden stick. Today, pediatricians would shudder at the honey, but the Victorians hadn't yet discovered infant botulism. As with so many domestic customs, grandparents took pride in handing down their favourite, tried and tested tricks, passing them on as badges of grit and ingenuity. Behind these, sometimes alarming strategies, is a through line of parental empathy. To be a Victorian mother wasn't merely about enduring long skirts and rigid etiquette. It meant comforting a wailing child through sleepless nights, improvising with whatever was on hand. The tools were different, but the impulse was eternal. Soothe the baby, spare the household. The teething ordeal also provided ample fodder for Victorian humorists. Publications like Punch delighted in cartoons lampooning grumpy, gum-rubbing infants and mothers reduced to a state of nervous prostration. Satirical etiquette handbooks offered playful advice for dealing with a child's first tooth, suggesting an orchestrated musical parade or a bracing walk in the rain to remind you it could always be worse. Of course, practical wisdom eventually won out. By the turn of the 20th century, the medical profession began warning about the perils of opiate-laced cures, and mothering manuals urged fresh air, clean water, and simpler, safer comforts. Pediatricians, still a rarity, recommended rusk biscuits and gentle distraction, a tedious but less risky prescription. Some of the old traditions faded away. Others, like the cold spoon, lingered on through the generations, though the teething cloth dipped in beer has, mercifully, vanished from nurseries. The heartbreak and hilarity of soothing a teething baby remains vividly familiar. In a way, it's one of the great unifiers across the centuries. Whether it's a carrot stick or a coral rattle, every parent has searched, sometimes desperately, for that magic fix. The specifics have changed, but the sentiment endures. Through thick, thin, and several missing hours of sleep, we're all just trying to help our little ones get through the tooth of the matter, Victorian style or otherwise. It's your third birthday, and instead of cake, you've got a tiny flagon of ale and a digestive biscuit. The local publican nods in approval while other toddlers chase each other around barrels. Who needs toys when you have so many things to trip over? The air is thick with the sharp scent of beer, sawdust, and centuries of spilt secrets. You're sitting on a high wooden stool, or at least your wool-clad bottom is perched at the edge, feet dangling several inches above the sticky floor. Every now and then, an uncle you've never met ruffles your hair and offers stern career advice, only to be distracted by the arrival of another round. Someone tries to teach you a drinking song about a dragon and a turnip, but you're mostly interested in the foamy bubbles popping up on the surface of your drink. Your biscuit, meanwhile, is losing its structural integrity with every dip. Around you, the pub is a chaos of laughter and plucky amateur musicians. Accordions wheeze, fiddles screech, and you half expect a chicken to wander through the legs of the crowd, although it's equally likely to be one of the neighbourhood toddlers, all of whom are caked in mud and biscuit crumbs. Your friends, if you can call them that, are locked in a high-stakes match of how many peas can you squash under a boot? The winner gets first dibs on the wooden horse in the corner, or possibly a shilling if one of the elders is feeling flush. Birthdays, in this era, aren't candle-lit affairs with carefully curated playlists and personalised cupcakes. It's more like a community-wide endorsement of your ongoing survival. Making it to 3 is cause for celebration. Odds are, by now you've already faced a stiff wind, a reckless pig, and at least one fever. Toddlers who can balance ale without spilling get suspiciously approving nods from adults. This is considered early training for adult life, or, judging by old Nan's cackle from the back room, possibly just a good excuse to let the grown-ups fate themselves on a weekday. Your mother is remarkably unfazed by your pint-sized pitcher of ale. She's spent the afternoon chatting with neighbours and occasionally glancing over to make sure you haven't fallen into the fireplace. There's a practical rhythm to the supervision. If you're upright and not bleeding, everything's going according to plan. When you totter a little more than usual after a sip, your father firmly removes the flagon, exchanging it for watered-down cider. It's a compromise. You still feel genuinely involved in the grown-up rituals, but the only hangover you'll get is from too many biscuits. In a world without smartphones or Peppa Pig marathons, the highlight of the day comes when the pub's resident storyteller climbs atop a crate. All small children gather round, sticky hands clasped, wide eyes blinking in anticipation. Tales swirl in the smoky air, giants defeated, rivers crossed, pies stolen by wily foxes. You forget the taste of ale and the ache in your knees. In these stories, every toddler gets to be the hero, at least in their own imagination. Judging from your audience, everyone believes it wholeheartedly. As afternoon stretches into evening, the pub glows golden. Candles flicker in bottles along the tables. The older children start an impromptu skittle tournament in the yard. You find yourself knee-deep in dandelions, chasing a half-inflated pig's bladder that has somehow become the official ball. Your birthday cake arrives at last, a mound of bread with a single apple on top. The adults sing a slurred tune, barely recognizable as a congratulatory song. Later, carried home in the crook of your father's arm, you're half asleep. Behind you, the sounds of laughter and fiddle tunes fade into the night, blending with the reassuring jangle of keys and the distant barking of dogs. Your first pub crawl may not end in a string of bad decisions and taxi receipts, but in the memory of muddy boots, sticky fingers, and the warm certainty that you're undeniably a part of the tribe. Sleep training, 19th century style, is less controlled crying and more, here's a tipple, off you go. Babies who fuss at night get a dash of beer in their milk, and everyone, parents included, sleeps like a log until sunrise. It's a solution that, to modern ears, sounds both absurd and slightly alarming. After all, contemporary parenting guides spend entire chapters debating the merits of swaddling versus white noise, pacifiers versus self-soothing. But in Victorian-era nurseries, the answer was as straightforward as the farm-fresh milk. Just enough alcohol to hush the midnight wails. This practice wasn't tucked away in the shadows either. It was a piece of open, practical advice found in ladies' magazines, household manuals, and passed down between generations, with the same gravitas as always wash behind the ears. Of course, the notion wasn't born purely out of the desire for uninterrupted sleep. Beer at the time was seen not merely as a recreational beverage, but a nourishing, almost medicinal concoction. Full-bodied, often cloudy, and far less alcoholic than today's brews. Some beers were little more potent than what we'd now call light, or table beer, sometimes as low as 2% ABV. The Victorians, ever pragmatic, reasoned that a little beer would pacify an infant's stomach, encourage sleep, and even, according to some maternal advice columns, boost appetite and growth. In the grand tradition of making do with what you have, nothing went to waste. Not even leftover dregs of ale. Parental exhaustion, it turns out, isn't a modern invention either. Diaries and letters from the era frequently bemoan the ordeal of nighttime waking. But instead of white-knuckle endurance or elaborate sleep consultants, the answer was at hand, and it came with a frothy head. Anecdotes abound of parents dozing in rocking chairs, a mug of mild ale balanced in one hand, their infant peacefully slumbering in the crook of the other. No wonder stories from the period are liberally sprinkled with references to the blessed, restorative sleep of a well-settled household. The science, as we now know, is less reassuring. Alcohol and developing brains do not mix, and modern pediatrics shudders at the thought of introducing booze to a bassinet. But in an age before formal sleep studies, pediatricians, or even the wider understanding of childhood development, instinct and anecdote trumped data. Beer babies appeared happy enough, and honestly, who was going to argue the point after everyone had finally caught a full night's rest? Beyond the nursery, the reputation of beer as a mild sleep aid stretched across the entire family tree. Elderly relatives sipped tiny glasses of night beer to settle their nerves. The working classes swore by a pint of mild to smooth the transition from late shift to bedtime. Medical texts from the era recommend nutritive ale for invalids, the convalescent, and the overtired. It was as much ritual as remedy, woven into the fabric of daily life. So much so that to question it would be to question common sense itself. Of course, this trust in beer as a balm for sleeplessness wasn't entirely misplaced. Alcohol has sedative properties, dulling the nervous system and providing that much-coveted drowsy peace. But the real secret to Victorian sleep might have been less about what was in the cup and more about the permission it gave, a cultural cue that, for this moment, rest is earned and worry can wait until dawn. In the end, the story of the beer and bedtime tradition is one of practicality wrapped in ritual, of families seeking comfort and quiet in a world without central heating, electric lights, or nanny cams. Today, we may cringe at the thought, but perhaps there's a glimmer of envy too, for a time when the answer to a sleepless night, however misguided, was as simple as raising a glass, closing your eyes, and surrendering to sleep. Forget your pediatrician's advice. Here, the family doctor prescribes a pint of weak ale for restlessness, fussiness, or slightly bad vibes. Modern medicine would call this malpractice. In 1842, it's called Thursday. If little Henry was being particularly spirited, the remedy wasn't time out or a stern talking to. It was a half mug of something brown and foamy. The same pharmacy that filled your prescription for cod liver oil also kept a small wooden cask behind the counter, labelled children's tonic. The ingredients list: mostly barley, water, a wink, and the implicit promise that, at the very least, everyone would be more relaxed by bedtime. The line between medicine and merriment was distinctly blurry. ailments from teething to sudden rage to a mysterious affliction dubbed the vapors, essentially a catch-all for anything that baffled adults, could be managed with booze, opium drops, or a lump of sugar soaked in gin. "Take two and call me in the morning," the doctor might have said, if not for the inconvenient fact that telephones wouldn't be invented for another 30 years. Don't misunderstand, this was considered the height of responsible parenting. The leading medical journals of the day, which were essentially long letters between cousins with good penmanship, regularly debated the virtues of different ales for different ages. Stout for the robust, pale ale for the delicate. Even small beer, a brew with barely enough alcohol to register, was preferred over plain water, which was viewed with deep suspicion. Water was unpredictable and full of mysterious animals. Beer, at least, was boiled, and if it happened to ease a tantrum or two, so much the better. This casual prescription of ale didn't just stop at the nursery door. Schoolmasters, prone to thinking that anything that quieted a classroom of 15 squirming 8-year-olds had to be good, sometimes poured it out as part of the mid-morning break. "It sharpens them up for recitation," one wrote in a dusty logbook, in a tone that suggests a certain self-satisfaction. Never mind that several pupils spent the rest of the day reciting the alphabet backwards. Of course, not everyone agreed. The occasional teetotaler, usually regarded as someone given to fainting, excessive hand-wringing, or dangerous modern ideas, might suggest cold milk instead of ale. Such radicalism went down about as easily as ipecac syrup. "Milk?" the local barber physician would scoff. "That's for calves. Children need something with backbone. Besides, cows were notoriously unreliable, often breaking into garden beds or refusing to be milked until the third try, whereas the brewer was always on time. To modern eyes, this all seems deeply absurd, if not outright alarming. But in the mid-19th century, the cracks in medical understanding were filled with equal parts bravado and barley. Germ theory hadn't yet arrived. Infection was the work of bad air or an ill-tempered north wind. The medical toolkit contained frighteningly few tools that actually worked. Faced with such uncertainty, physicians and parents alike grabbed onto what they knew. If small people were unhappy, little tipples smoothed things out. And, inevitably, there were unintended side effects. Henry, the restive child in question, might sleep soundly or lapse into giggle fits, depending on the doctor's generosity with his paw. The line between medicine and mischief was as thin as a pub napkin. Long-standing family myths. Your grandfather was walking by age 9 months after a spoonful of sherry, grew up alongside these cultural habits, reinforced with every raised glass. Yet, for all its absurdity, the story of the 1842 family doctor reminds us that most medical traditions, however bizarre, are rooted in the human yearning to do something, however misguided, to care for the unwell. And if yesterday's prescription is today's punchline, that only means we're still learning. Cheers to progress and to never putting ale in the baby's bottle again. Weaning a baby used to mean transitioning from mother's milk to, mother's mug. The baby beer is less about reckless parenting and more a matter of not dying of cholera. Drink up, or else. Today, for most of us, weaning means gradually introducing baby food, little jars of purees, and, if you're lucky, a high chair that doesn't collapse under emotional pressure. But in medieval and early modern Europe, parents faced a different kind of pressure. The local water supply was basically a microbial roulette, and the odds were not in your favour. When milk ran out, safe hydration for children was, let's be honest, an oxymoron. Enter the unexpected hero. Low alcohol, small beer. Yes, beer, the breakfast of survivors. Imagine being presented with 2 breakfast choices, a nice mug of questionable water or a frothy, lightly alcoholic beverage brewed in part to kill off anything that would kill you. Parents weren't just trying to make the family dinner party more lively. They were choosing the option least likely to result in a short obituary. But before you imagine toddlers tipsy on IPA, let's clarify. The beer in question was less party in a pint and more like today's weak kombucha. Small beer was so diluted that even the most Puritan church lady would approve. Its alcohol content was enough to take the edge off inevitable pathogens, but not enough to send little Timmy into an existential crisis. Still, it's hard not to imagine the mixed messaging. Here's a child, barely into his gap-toothed years, being handed a mug and told, "It's this, or dysentery, kid." This was a world where public health meant teaching everyone to brew. For centuries, children were raised not on cow's milk, but on a communal staple that was as reliable as boiling water and way more fun to rhyme about in nursery verses. This practice wasn't limited to the rural peasantry. In fact, wealthier kids might have had access to finer ales, while farm families nursed their young with whatever brew would filter out the local disease of the month. Medical texts of the time even recommended ale possets or wine and bread soaks for sickly babies. You might think this is the reason British children sound like they're born with wry humour, but it's probably just survival instinct. By the 19th century, advances in water sanitation and an embarrassing number of illustrated pamphlets on malt liquor and morality gradually dried up the baby beer boom. The tide started turning in favour of clean water and actual milk that didn't immediately curdle under one's gaze. But it took more than a few generations for the cultural residues of boozy weaning to ferment away. To this day, some traditional toasts and folk songs trace their origins to this historical practice. It's worth pausing to recognise just how resourceful and adaptive caregivers were. No one wanted their toddler to develop a taste for lagers, but needs must when the creek turns green. In a sense, the baby beer story is about resilience. Parents leveraging whatever knowledge and resources they had to give their children a fighting chance. So, if you find yourself horrified or weirdly impressed, remember, every era has its questionable baby-raising advice. Today, it's screen time. In the past, it was yeast content. Tomorrow, who knows? But at least, thanks to thousands of years of pragmatic trial and error, and maybe a slightly tipsy toddler, we've got options that don't come with a hangover. And as for that age-old question of wean or not to wean, just be grateful your answer doesn't involve a tankard. You worry about hand sanitizer. Victorians worry about the neighbour's goat getting into the communal well and not coming out. Beer is the hand sanitizer of the gut. Germ theory is still 20 years away, but nobody trusts clear water. Sensible, right? Let's paint the world of Victorian hygiene. Not the rosemary-washed hair and starched cuffs of period dramas, but the real deal. The sort of hygiene that makes you grateful for today's flush toilet. In the average Victorian home, there's no indoor plumbing, just a chamber pot tucked discreetly under the bed. Slop buckets empty out into shared cesspits behind the row houses, and those night soil men who haul the results away. They're your sanitation system, if you're lucky enough to afford them. Otherwise, your waste floats downhill with the rain, collecting in alleyways and seepage wells. You hold your nose and step high. Public water comes from pumps and wells, but sources are sketchy. The River Thames, both a water supply and open sewer, sparkles with more than reflected sunlight. Cholera stalks the city, slipping in through water that looked clean but hid invisible killers. People don't understand bacteria, but they do notice. Every time Cousin Edith drinks well water, she spends a week in bed with the fever. It's enough to make anyone reach for beer, Safer, since the brewing process kills off nasties. Even children drink low-alcohol, small beer, which is less about merriment, more a survival tactic. Bathing? An ordeal, not a ritual. Water is expensive when you have to haul and heat it yourself. Baths happen once a week. Maybe. Shared. Reused by the whole family, starting with the father and ending with the smallest child. Soap is coarse, for laundry mostly, and the idea of washing hands before eating is newfangled, something only fussy aristocrats or eccentric doctors encourage. Laundry circles the same wagons. Clothes are washed every few weeks, sometimes less, since soap costs extra and drying space is at a premium in smoggy cities. Instead, Victorians rely on layers of clothing to soak up sweat and grime, swapping out collars and cuffs, if you're middle class, or simply airing everything on a windowsill if you're not. Perfume and pomades mask what can't be cleaned away. Despite all this, standards are shifting. Progress means printed pamphlets on cleanliness, and charity campaigns give out carbolic soap with strict instruction. Florence Nightingale, the era's most determined hand washer, launches crusades for sanitation in hospitals, armed only with mathematical charts and a steely frown. Yet, to the average Londoner, all of this is strange science. The miasma theory, bad air causes disease, still lingers, so people hang pungent herbs in doorways and keep windows open, whatever the weather. Fast forward to your world. You wield antibacterial wipes in one hand, touchless soap dispensers in the other. Hospitals bristle with disinfectants, and we trust that pipes deliver clean water. So much so, few think twice about drinking straight from the tap. The communal well is a relic. The chance of dysentery, a historical footnote. Microbes are textbook villains, fought with vaccines rather than vinegar fumes. But the anxiety never quite goes away. It just changes faces. Where Victorians dread the bad air from the Thames on a hot July afternoon, you scan news headlines about superbugs and schedule hand-washing tutorials for toddlers. Their world braced for outbreaks of cholera and typhoid. Yours wrestles with norovirus and antibiotic resistance. 150 years, and still we try to outwit the invisible enemy. So yes, your bottle of hand sanitizer is the modern heir of that pint of small beer. The rituals look different, but the stakes are familiar. Clean hands, safe sips, and a lingering suspicion of what lurks unseen. The difference is, you've got germ theory, and they just had to hope the neighbour's goat chose a different well. At Sunday lunch, the adults and kids drink similar beverages, just with different ratios. Your high chair has a coaster carved into the tray. Cheers. The food might be grey, but at least you're all hydrated. Sunday afternoons in your childhood kitchen. Sunlight bending through the lace curtains. Dust motes swirling in the golden light. The table is stacked high, with platters. Roast something, mash something else, and rolls always flanking the action like soft, starchy security guards. But in the centre sits what everyone truly anticipates, the pitcher, sometimes lemonade, sometimes punch. A mysterious house blend of ginger ale, apple juice, and whatever was near expiration in the fridge. For grown-ups, a glug of wine or a short, proud pour of sherry migrates quietly into these innocent-looking glasses. Glasses sweat on polished wood, rings blooming and fading as the meal stretches on. The kids, high on the novelty of ice cubes and the forbidden fizz of ginger ale, clink their plastic cups with all the seriousness of a business lunch on Wall Street. On special occasions, a single maraschino. Cherry floats in the glass, worshipped, chased, and disputed. You got two. Yours is bigger. Negotiations escalate. Peace is brokered. Sips are traded. No one remembers the taste of the grey chicken. But everyone remembers the cherry. It's these family meals where you first learn diplomacy, sometimes through the distribution of gravy, sometimes in the silent eye contact exchanged as your uncle slips a stray whiskey cube into his punch. Rules are gently bent. Kids whisper, "What's in that glass?" Grown-ups reply, "Never you mind." But you mind. You take mental notes. You learn that sometimes adults aren't just sipping liquid, they're sipping a private ritual. One not meant for children, or explained in terms you'd understand. Beverages mark time at the table. Little ones begin with milk, lukewarm, in cups with cartoon faces. They graduate to juice, diluted with equal parts water. A rite of passage lauded on birthdays or afternoons when someone felt extra generous. Soda is a rare treat. The liquid crown jewel rolled out for guests or on holidays, poured over ice cubes that crack and whisper. Meanwhile, adults start and end their meal with something earthier, deep red, tart, spicy, or sharp. You'd watch the parade of bottles and mismatched mugs with wide-eyed curiosity. And, inevitably, someone spills. The tablecloth absorbs it, adults mumble, and napkins flutter. At your seat, your tray cup holder is both status symbol and shield. You are, for the moment, immune to the chaos, until, of course, the cherry in your glass escapes, rolling off onto the linoleum, prompting laughter that stitches generations together. Everyone has a story about spilled drinks. That one time Grandpa knocked over his wine, the year the dog lapped up someone's cider, the legendary event when an entire pitcher of punch made a break for freedom, and the kitchen smelled like fruit for days. Liquid calories become memories more than menace at these dinners. Yes, someone will warn, "That's a lot of sugar," or "Don't let them have refills." But no one tracks ounces poured when the company is good and the conversation turns again to family legends. The ritual of filling glasses, raising them, making silly toasts, to grey food, to cherries, anchors the meal even more than the soggy broccoli or overcooked roast. Long after the plates are cleared, when you've traded the high chair for a creaky, grown-up seat, the nostalgia of those liquid-laden meals lingers. You'll pour yourself a drink, water, juice, even a grown-up tipple, and remember how hydration was just another excuse to stay a little longer at a table where everyone had a place and everyone, at least for the afternoon, was a little less thirsty and a little more together. Let me know if you'd like this section tweaked, condensed, or if you want to emphasize different aspects. On rare occasions, you wake up cranky and your nap time, hangover, needs more than a nap. Don't worry, a bit of hair of the dog is perfectly acceptable. The official Victorian term, infant fortification. Now, before you imagine a baby swirling a brandy snifter and contemplating life's injustices, let's clarify. In the Victorian era, infant fortification often meant a touch of alcohol slipped into the milk bottle, or perhaps a medicinal syrup with a little kick. The logic: if adults can take a draught to ward off a headache, why not the little ones? The result, more often than not, was a blissfully napping infant and an equally blissful parent who could finally finish their newspaper in peace. Of course, modern science recommends nothing of that sort, but historical context helps frame just how desperate parents have always been for solutions. But headaches, even in babies, are not just figments of exhausted parental imagination. While a true migraine in a first-year baby is mercifully rare, the physical experience, a mixture of fussiness, sensitivity to light, that vague sense of cosmic injustice, can be pretty real. You, small hero, have discovered that sometimes, after a marathon session of peekaboo, or an overly enthusiastic visit from Aunt Beryl, not all is well in that soft, mysterious head of yours. Symptoms may include the following: clutching your soft toys a little tighter, turning away from bright lights and giving a cranky, suspicious glare to the cheerful animal mobile overhead. Crying, of course, is the universal signal, though, as with all baby illnesses, this is as much an expression of hunger, discomfort, or existential dread as it is a plea for ibuprofen. If you find yourself in this foggy state, even the tastiest pureed banana or the most elaborate game of this little piggy will do little to cheer you. A patient parent may try to decipher the cause, running down the usual checklist. Are you teething, gassy, overstimulated by that jangly musical toy from grandma who means well? If all else fails, and you still wear your headache like a tiny grumpy crown, this is the moment for parental intervention. Today, your caregivers have a far more refined tool set than their Victorian predecessors. Gone are the days of the fortifying drops, now replaced with extra cuddles, cool washcloths, and, after a cautious discussion, perhaps an approved, doctor-sanctioned dose of acetaminophen. The lights are dimmed, the noise is hushed, and the order of the day is gentle rocking and whispered reassurances that soon enough the world will set itself right again. Sometimes the solution is as simple as a change of scenery. A gentle walk outside, fresh air being the timeless elixir for all cranky humans, big or small, might banish the worst of the malaise. Perched in a stroller, wrapped in a favourite blanket, you might stop wailing long enough to remember that, despite your pounding head, there are birds to watch, clouds to study, and the oddly calming rhythm of passing wheels on pavement. But if there's one lesson that comes from the tale of the baby's first headache, it's this. Discomfort, however minor, is always a mystery and a challenge for both parties involved. You are tasked with expressing the inexpressible, and your parents are charged with reading the hieroglyphics of your tears and sighs. Every family develops their personal algorithm, a combination of intuition, deduction, and sheer guesswork. At its core, the baby headache saga is less about pain and more a rite of passage. Parents confronting the limits of their own knowledge, and you, the baby, learning that a little comfort can go a long way. No Victorian toddy required. Patent medicines are lined up on every shelf. Most contain opiates, all claim to calm a fussy baby in seconds. Compared to those mysterious concoctions, beer is practically a health drink. Victorian high street chemists probably looked more like Willy Wonka's chocolate factory than any trusted apothecary. Gaudily labelled bottles promised instant cures for every ailment from female weakness to baldness and indigestion. Dr. Bateman's pectoral drops, Godfrey's cordial, and Mother Bailey's quieting syrup all sound innocent enough until you read the ingredients. Laudanum, chloroform, morphine, or a hearty splash of raw alcohol were not uncommon. The cruder the medicine, the more likely it was that you'd forget all about your symptoms, or possibly your own name. If you're wondering how anything this bonkers became mainstream, just imagine today's pharmacy aisles. Except the main ingredient in the children's teething syrup is opium, and your cough syrup comes with an advisement to take liberally and frequently, especially in times of stress. Parents desperate for sleep snatched up bottles, trusting the cheery advertisements with beaming babies and testimonials like, "Little Marjorie hasn't uttered a peep since we started the syrup," which, to be fair, was probably true, just not for the reasons you'd hope. The Victorian era was an age of faith in progress, but medical science didn't always keep up with invention. There were no official testing standards. Anyone could slap together a remedy, stick a doctor's picture on the label, and tout it in newspapers as the latest scientific marvel. A respectable beard helped. Regulation was virtually non-existent, so a mercifully short-lived concoction might mix turpentine and honey, and sleep remedies might cause a deeper, more permanent kind of rest. Long before side effects may include, let alone do not operate heavy machinery, medicines were judged purely on how fast they got results. Never mind that calming a fussy child could also mean sedating a small child into oblivion. Opium-based mixtures like Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, marketed for babies, were household staples. Druggists weren't required to list ingredients, so many genuine family tragedies ended up as learning moments for public health, though not until the headlines read more like horror stories than testimonials. It wasn't just ordinary folk who fell victim. At the apex of society, even Queen Victoria's own doctor prescribed a smorgasbord of potent odds and ends. Her favourite was a tincture of cannabis and wine for period pain, with a shot of laudanum for truly bad days. Respectable ladies relied on tonics promising to imbue the female system with vigour, which usually meant infusing the nervous system with enough narcotics to sleep through an opera. Many wealthy men, not to be outdone, took daily pick-me-ups for their nerves. Equal parts brandy, bitters, and secret ingredients best left, well, secret. There was a social side too. Patented remedies were handed out as party favours and proudly displayed at dinner parties. People debated favourite brands at garden gatherings, like Victorians today might compare craft beers. A well-curated medicine cabinet could be a status symbol, and knowing which new syrup was all the rage showed one's modern sensibilities. Unfortunately, a little too much of a good thing almost certainly meant trouble. Death by medicine cabinet was shockingly common. Ultimately, the tide turned not through science, but scandal. A handful of headline-making tragedies and a rising chorus of skeptical doctors eventually led to the beginnings of regulation. The Pharmacy Act of 1868 in Britain required opiates to be sold only by licensed chemists. Even then, reforms arrived in slow, uneven waves, and dubious cures never really vanished. They just became less overt. Today, we look back with a shudder, but hard candies, cough drops, and the belief in a quick fix for every ailment are still with us. The main difference: the secret ingredients are more likely to be sugar and caffeine than laudanum. Somehow, Victorian medicine's Wild West era managed to combine optimism, innocence, and outright obliviousness. A reminder that sometimes you really are better off just having a beer. Dear Mrs. Worthington, my baby cries at night. Should I try beer, laudanum, or just louder screaming? Victorian parenting advice swings wildly between give them alcohol and send them to the country for fresh air. Guaranteed disagreement in every letter. One could fill a mahogany chest with every contradicting pearl of wisdom published in the 1840s. Open any advice column and you'll find pithy suggestions from Mrs. Worthington, Dr. Tipton, or an anonymous, concerned parent of Cheltenham, each certain their cure-all is gospel. One letter solemnly recommends cod liver oil for strengthening the child's constitution, while the next staunchly warns that cod liver oil may result in an unseemly robustness bordering on vulgarity. The average parent, caught in the crossfire, is left bewildered, clutching this month's Lady's Companion and wondering if their child will make it to adulthood or will instead dissolve into a faintly medicinal mist. Many of these columns read less like modern advice and more like a lively debate in a pub. Except the remedies on offer include apply a mustard poultice, or wrap the babe in a well-worn petticoat and pray for improved humours. Should a child refuse vegetables, A doctor's tonic of powdered rhubarb and patience is suggested. If that fails, an aunt from Bath might urge, let the child roam barefoot in the meadows, and appetite will follow. Disagreement is the only constant, and mothers are left to triangulate truth from a bewildering triangulation of op-eds. Laudanum, a tincture of opium, was touted as the sleeping draught of angels by its advertisers. A mother from Yorkshire writes in, "Dear Mrs. Worthington, is it permissible to dose my twins with laudanum so that I might enjoy an evening's waltz?" The response, "Only on Tuesdays, but beware, excess may render your children affectionate but listless." Others disparage such modern concoctions and instead invoke the ancient art of airing out babies, preferably by placing them on a breezy windowsill, whatever the month. Complicating matters further, fathers occasionally pen their own advice. Let the boy climb trees, and he will sleep through the night, opines Mr. Harrington of Exeter, his letter sandwiched between scandalised mothers debating whether a sour apple is a tonic or a terror. If a child displays spiritedness, one grandmother solemnly advises a teaspoon of port wine, night and morning. Another cautions that spirited children are best subdued with Dickens, or, failing that, embroidery. Discipline oscillates from a firm word and a cold compress to let the child govern itself entirely, that it may know liberty and the consequences thereof. No 1840s column is complete without a hearty plug for fresh air. Send your little ones to the country as soon as they begin to cough. So recommends the ever-anonymous mother of 6. City air, according to 10 columns out of 12. Rots the mind and sours the temperament. One particularly despairing father, doubtless choking on London fog, asks if ponies might be used to speed up delicate constitutions, to which Mrs. Worthington replies, "Ponies are delightful, Mr. Blake, provided they are not kept in your nursery." All this advice is seasoned with brisk, faintly moralising asides. Naughtiness reflects a lack of proper boiled pudding, one infers. Another warns that reading novels before breakfast makes for pale and irritable youths. Amidst the chaos, some guidance endures. Hug your child, but not so much as to spoil the starch in their collar. A stew of sternness and tenderness, myth and medicine. The 1840s advice columns form a patchwork of sincere, sometimes hilarious, occasionally harrowing attempts to civilize the next generation. In the end, the takeaways would leave the modern parent reeling. Some advice merely bemuses, bathe weekly, except Sundays, while some horrifies. Opium may quiet the colicky child. But above all, Victorian advice columns make clear that parents have always struggled to do right by their children, flailing, failing, fumbling through a morass of baffling suggestions, always searching for sleep, comfort, and the elusive recipe for a happy child. The real MVPs are your local brewers. Without them, half the town would have been wiped out by the average glass of Victorian tap water. Kids literally toasted these people from the high chair. It's hard for most people today to picture just how dire things were. Victorian water wasn't something you drank unless life insurance was paid up and you'd already said your goodbyes. The flavour notes included hints of cholera, with a subtle aftertaste of dysentery. Yet, there was one group bravely shouldering the burden of public health. Your neighbourhood brewer. Forget doctors. Forget city planners. If you wanted to make it to 30, you owed a lot more to the local guy in the apron than any surgeon with a blood-stained sore. Breweries weren't just places to grab a pint. They were, essentially, water treatment plants, with better advertising. Brewing beer or ale meant boiling the water, which conveniently killed all the bacteria and parasites that made fresh water the the liquid equivalent of Russian roulette. The alcohol content wasn't high enough to leave you day drunk by noon, well, usually, but it was just enough to keep you from a 3-day bout of stomachache that doubled as a crash diet. Even kids got in on the action. Before you picture rowdy toddlers doing a conga line at the pub, clarify this in your mind. We're talking about small beer. This wasn't your modern IPA. Small beer was barely alcoholic. Think boozy breadwater, about as dangerous as a ripe banana. But it was safer than anything coming out of the town pump. So babies teethed on it, kids brought it in their lunch pails, and adults relied on it for, well, hydration. Milk was a gamble due to iffy, cows, and zero refrigeration. The real "got milk" posters should have starred a local barmaid and a very responsible-looking toddler. Old-timey brewers didn't have degrees or snazzy titles. Their university was life-or-death trial and error. They tinkered with recipes in ways that would terrify a modern chemist. Throw in some different grains, use rainwater if the well looked fishy, experiment with whatever fermentation vessel wasn't doubling as a planter or a footbath. Sometimes things went sideways, but when you're thirsting for survival, what's a little extra funk in the flavour? Yet, even these unsung heroes were sometimes looked down on by the local elites, until everyone caught the same bug, and suddenly the humble brewer was the most popular and busy person in town. Their shops became quasi-community centres, where news was swapped, deals struck, and, one imagines, a few stilted attempts at matchmaking took place while the tap was flowing. The classic public house wasn't a den of vice, it was an essential service. If you could tip a hat, you tipped it to the brewer. Of course, the gear was nothing like today's steampunk-themed microbrewery setups. Picture-cracked kettles, wooden mash tuns, and whatever barrels the cooper hadn't already written off as leaky. It was hands-on, messy work, and in the winter, if you didn't keep the yeast warm enough, you could end up with a batch best served to the garden, not the neighbours. Still, these folks carried on, mixing, pouring, tasting, and, presumably, hoping for the best. So next time someone rhapsodizes about artisanal this or small batch that, just remember, the real craft beer movement started because nobody wanted to die from a glass of water. The old-timey brewer didn't have Instagram, but their legacy is the reason you're here to double tap a selfie in a beer hall today. Raise a pint, or a sippy cup, and salute the silent sudsy saviours of the past. Without them, cheers might have sounded a lot more like goodbye. Not everyone was on board with the baby beer craze. There were uptight reformers, physicians with strong opinions, and the occasional grandma who thought tea was Satan's broth. Still, the practice persisted, mostly through stubbornness. While many families saw baby beer as just another quirky chapter in the book of child rearing, critics were never far behind. Reformers, often parading about in austere black hats and moral certitude, considered any trace of alcohol in a nursery bottle as close to child abuse as you could get before running afoul of local laws. Sermons decried the poisoning of youth, with church bulletins lamenting that the nation's nurslings are being led astray one swig at a time. Temperance activists, still smarting from the failures of prohibition a generation earlier, now set their sights on the most defenseless demographic. Toddlers, medical professionals too, lined up on both sides. Doctors, who'd survived the Civil War with little more than sores and whiskey, suddenly embraced an age of scientific rigour. Medical journals began to fill with essays penned in elaborate cursive, warning that alcohol might retard the development of the juvenile mind, or force upon the child a most unfortunate constitution, both morally and otherwise. Of course, these same journals featured advertisements for laudanum syrups and cocaine-infused toothache drops just a few pages later. Hypocrisy, it seemed, was on tap as freely as milk stout. Not all opposition came from the halls of academia or bitter pulpits, however. Much of it bubbled up in homes themselves. There were, for example, the family disputes that played out between progressive young mothers eager to try the latest healthful trend, and stern matriarchs unwilling to part with herbal broths and bone broth traditions. One could imagine a parlour scene. A mother, brow furrowed, decanting a splash of beer over mashed-up potatoes, while her own mother clucked disapprovingly from her rocking chair. "In my day," she'd mutter, "babies drank barley water, not brewer's yeast." Domestic tensions simmered alongside pot-bellied stoves. Satirical cartoons in newspapers ran wild with these stories. One 19th century illustration poked fun at the modern infant. A cherub comfortably reclined in a high chair, mug in hand, sporting a 5 o'clock shadow. The caption dripped with sarcasm, stronger stuff than mother's milk. Editorials followed, bemoaning a lost golden age of discipline and warning that the next generation would grow up to be inebriated delinquents. Or, worse, socialists. There were more personal resistors too. Unsung heroes and stubborn coots who simply didn't buy into the trend. Urban legend tells of an anonymous New England grandmother who, when confronted by her daughter's attempt to offer her grandchild a swig, declared, "If the child must drink something strong, let it be my dandelion tonic." Apparently, said tonic was alcoholic, but that's beside the point. Despite these voices, the practice of serving baby beer never became a true battleground. At least not in the way the great debates over vaccination, spanking, or breakfast cereals would. Perhaps it was dismissed as too silly, or more likely, life was simply too busy to sustain long-term outrage. Still, naysaying persisted in quiet ways, in knowing glances, snide remarks at church socials, and even the occasional anonymous tip to the ever-vigilant local doctor. But change was inevitable. As scientific methods grew more robust and popular magazines started to endorse pasteurized milk over lager, the critics gained steam. By mid-century, baby beer had become more punchline than prescription. A relic best left to memory and mocking toasts. And so, the critics and naysayers may never have toppled the practice outright, but they did what critics do best. They hastened the en march of modernity, occasionally with a scolding finger, a letter to the editor, or just a well-placed joke at the family dinner table. In the end, it was less an outright ban and more a slow, slightly hungover bow to common sense. It's not Oktoberfest for babies. The ale given to infants is weak, closer to tangy oatmeal water than your uncle's IPA. But it's enough to knock the edges off a bad teething night or the taste of boiled carrots. Let's be clear up front. We aren't talking about slosh swaddlers staggering through medieval kitchens. The small beer, or ale, handed to even the youngest family members was often barely alcoholic by modern standards, typically between 0.5% and 2% ABV. For comparison, a can of classic American root beer today is 0%, and a light beer might clock in at around 4%. In other words, these drinks had just a whisper of alcohol. The goal wasn't to send anyone to nap time with the spins. It was mostly about safety. Medieval water could be a microbial minefield. Fermentation, however modest, helped keep those lurking bacteria at bay. You might be picturing a harried mother, perhaps in a thatched cottage, splashing a dollop of 12% monk-brewed elixir into her child's cup. Not so. Household ale, or small beer, was a staple, something more akin to what we'd call a vitamin water or really weak kombucha than a craft brew you sip at a trendy bar. The brewing process was simple, but purposeful. Grains, often barley, were steeped and boiled, then strained and lightly fermented. Any alcohol present was just an unintentional fringe benefit, like that accidental tan you get while gardening. Of course, people quickly figured out the different strengths of their homemade concoctions. There are accounts of second runnings, a brewing tradition where the brewer would use the same grains for multiple batches. The first batch, the strong beer, was for the adults, or maybe saved for occasions like a major feast when nobody cared if Uncle Edric started singing. But by the time you reached the third or fourth run, the small beer, you were looking at a drink so tame it would barely register as alcoholic today. That last batch was what ended up in the beaker beside the high chair. So, was anyone worried about the cradle crowd catching a buzz? Surprisingly, not really. The mild effect of small beer was likely just enough to take the edge off fussy afternoons, and probably less potent than the cough syrup some modern parents think nothing of doling out on a rough night. And, unlike a modern cocktail, the calories actually mattered. Those lagers delivered much-needed energy when diets were otherwise monotone and meagre. Plus, beer was cheap, relatively easy to make, and didn't spoil as quickly as plain water. For the grown-ups, stronger ales could absolutely pack a punch. A festive haul could run on barrels pushing 6-8% ABV, with the beer flowing as freely as the conversation and gossip. But these were carefully distinguished from the everyday brews that kept the family hydrated and, yes, sometimes helped calm a teething baby. The lines between nourishment, medication, and mild mood enhancer were blurred, sometimes deliberately. Modern folks might bristle at the thought, beer for babies? But it's important to zoom out and see the context. With disease-laden water sources a persistent risk and infant mortality heartbreakingly high, small beer was the safer, cheaper option. A little yeast performing a medieval life hack. Was it habit-forming? Not at these low doses. In reality, it was probably just enough to coax a nap or make mushy peas slightly more palatable. So no, infants won't flop over in their cradles seeing visions of sugar plum fairies. They were just quieted, hydrated, and, probably, a little less grumpy about their dinner of lamp-warmed root vegetables. The buzz was more a gentle hum, a background note in the daily rhythms of survival, not a headline event. In the grand sweep of history, this little bit of booze was the lesser evil. And, as odd as it sounds today, for most families, it just made sense. Today's sippy cups have anti-spill technology and bright colours. The 1840s version, a pewter mug, small enough for a toddler's grip, with a half-hearted parental warning, don't drop it on your toes. This was cutting-edge childcare in the Victorian era. Pewter mugs were, if nothing else, indestructible. They doubled as snack storage and projectile weapon. Toddlers back then didn't just master the fine art of not spilling. They learned basic Newtonian physics, gravity, and the unpredictable ricochet of metal on stone kitchen floors. Spill-proof? Not at all. Character building? Unquestionably. Fast forward to the 1920s. Glass baby bottles made an entrance. Sturdy, yes, but about as toddler-friendly as a pet tarantula. Here you go, darling. Here's something both fragile and filled with curdling milk. Please try not to toss it at your sister. Parents quickly realized the need for more durable, less shatter-prone options, especially once kitchen tiles became fashionable. The actual sippy cup, as we recognize it, lid, spout, and spill-resistant aspirations, didn't make its debut until the late 20th century. The origin story goes something like this. One very tired parent, too many milk-soaked mornings, and a eureka moment involving plastic, a snap-on lid, and the keen realization that if locks could keep toddlers out of cabinets, maybe they could keep juice inside a cup. Thus, the sippy cup was more or less born out of the same innovation cycle that brought us childproofing and headache medication. And so began the great sippy cup arms race. Manufacturers introduced rubber gaskets, one-way valves, and handles engineered for maximal chubby-fingered clutching. No more were parents settling for mostly contained. Now, they demanded NASA-grade spill protection. Kitchens everywhere filled with an arsenal of experimental sippy designs. Straw cups, hard spouts, soft spouts, weighted bottoms that promise to right themselves like a tipsy weeble. Each promise less chaos and more hydration, which, as any exhausted parent will tell you, is the real holy grail. Of course, the sippy cup's evolution tracked with trends in pediatric psychology and parental guilt. Late-night talk shows and parenting magazines solemnly debated, is a sippy cup depriving your child of real cup skills? Gone were the halcyon days of pewter mugs doubling as makeshift hammers. Now it was about developmental milestones. The race was on not only to keep milk off the carpet, but to train the next generation of open cup Olympians. Enter the eco-revolution. By the 2010s, plastic anxiety set in. Suddenly, parents scrutinized the fine print for BPA-free assurances. Stainless steel sippy cups emerged as the new status symbol, perched loftily in a sea of well-meaning, toxin-concerned tote bags. Silicone spouts were lauded as gentle on gums. Some sippy cups began tracking hydration via smartphone apps, which probably says something about how far we've come, and how far we've wandered off the practical path. Yet, no matter how advanced the sippy cup has become, certain universal truths prevail. Toddlers still chew through the spout like tiny beavers. Parents are still doomed to locate at least one leaky cup fossilized beneath the car seat. And family pets, given half a chance, will absolutely slurp up anything spilled, regardless of anti-spill claims. At its core, the sippy cup reflects both our endless innovation and our unwavering hope that, just maybe, we can outsmart the chaos of childhood. It stands as a tiny, brightly coloured testament to human optimism, and perhaps to our willingness to believe in miracle gadgets, even as we mop up after them. From pewter mugs wielded like medieval tankards to silicone-laden, Bluetooth-enabled marvels, the humble sippy cup has journeyed through time, enduring trends, tantrums, and technological leaps. And through every era, it has served as a gentle reminder to parents. Spill happens, sippy cup or not. Victorian dads prided themselves on teaching children resilience, starting with, "Finish your pint and don't whine." Family bonding was mostly a contest to see who could pretend the beer tasted good the longest. Childhood in the Victorian home was less about parental warmth and more about enduring minor, curious torments with a stiff upper lip. To be a father, back then, meant embracing the dual roles of domestic drill sergeant and philosopher king, the latter evidenced by lengthy mealtime lectures on why a cold bath built character. For every paternal, be grateful in my day, we ate gravel, there was a child silently calculating how much gravel they could fake eat to end the story faster. Fathers operated with an unofficial rule book full of maxims. Tears are for the weak, bandages are overrated, and emotional expression of any kind is to be filed under foreign innovation. When it came to childhood ailments or playground bruises, Dad's first question was, "Did you die?" An effective litmus test for further medical attention, at least by Victorian standards. On weekends, fatherly bonding might take the form of a brisk walk, Victorian code for "Follow me, children, as I stride half a mile ahead. If you can still see me over the horizon, you're not trying hard enough." There was little time for coddling. A pat on the back signalled either deep affection or that you were blocking access to the butter dish at breakfast. The Victorian patriarch's goal wasn't cruelty, but a sort of familial preparing of the fittest. The world was, after all, full of cholera, horse carts, and, on rare occasions, a mother-in-law. If you learned to stomach treacle pudding and criticism, you would surely survive the rest. A father's love was carefully camouflaged as gruffness, affection expressed as a raised eyebrow, or perhaps letting you stir the Christmas pudding without comment about your obvious lack of wrist strength. Dinner-time stories often doubled as thinly veiled cautionary tales. Uncle Harold, who dared to question the price of a pint, would soon disappear from the family narrative, never to be mentioned again, except as a footnote on parental wisdom. You see, a father would say, folding the newspaper decisively, we don't need cranky reformers in this house. We drink. We move on. Yet, for all their sternness, Victorian dads managed the occasional sentimental gesture, usually disguised as a practical joke. Slip a boiled sweet into a jacket pocket. Challenge your children to stoic silence during a wintry church service. Or teach them the family's secret handshake. 2 firm pumps. 1 conspiratorial eyebrow raise. No hugs. Evenings might find father nodding along to a child's recitation, all while fighting sleep as only a true patriarch could. Head lolling at a precise 45 degrees, monocle precariously aligned. Truly, if you crack the code, Victorian fatherhood was a masterclass in tough love, aimed always at preparing children for the stoic march of adulthood. The uncertainty, however, lay in interpretation. Did father truly know best? Or was he simply as baffled as everyone else, papering over his doubts with beer and platitudes? Children, sensing their own parents' doubts, learn to carry on the charade, sharing looks across the table that quietly declared, "We know, Dad, and we'll finish our pint, even if it tastes like despair." Perhaps the ultimate lesson was that resilience isn't just about swallowing questionable beverages, but about mastering the fine art of pretense, smiling at adversity, raising a glass to the absurdity of childhood, and resolving, someday, to confuse your own children with perplexing acts of paternal wisdom. In surviving Dad's household, you didn't just learn to finish your pint. You learned to do so with style, timing, and just enough dramatic flair to earn a glimmer of fatherly pride before the next story began. Baby showers and children's birthdays involve more drinking than you'd expect. No one remembers the gifts, but everyone remembers the sleepy babies drowsing under the coats. Imagine the scene. A parlour crammed full of starch petticoats and uncomfortable aunts. The air thick with the sweet musk of crushed rose petals and pipe tobacco. A pile of shawls on the settee doubles as both a fashion accessory graveyard and, unbeknownst to most, a makeshift creche for infants who, in a haze of sherry fumes and general Victorian merriment, had decided it was all simply too much. Adults may have excused themselves after just 1 glass of punch, but it was the youngest guests who demonstrated the real cost of hospitality. By the time the 4th toast rolled around, the babies were out cold, their parents blithely swapping stories above them in clouds of laughter and wine breath. Lest you think I exaggerate, the Victorians were infamous for what we might politely call communal indulgence. The drinks were rarely just for adults. Even the smallest party guests could expect a taste of something fortifying. For children in teething agony, gin was recommended. For mothers, wine was not just a social lubricant, but medicinal, staunching everything from fatigue to nervous disorders, which conveniently included the stress of hosting 5 dozen extended cousins in your front room. Of course, party games and entertainment had their own strange relationship with these festive libations. One child's birthday in a respectable London suburb might feature a spirited round of Snapdragon, a game that involved retrieving raisins from a platter set alight with brandy, undeterred by singed fingertips and the odd scorched eyebrow. Such amusements remained popular with adults who, perhaps unwisely, combined competitive spirit with generous helpings of claret punch, giving new meaning to the term party burn. And yet the after effects were as communal as the celebration. Victorian party hosts had recipes, not just for sweet cakes and jellied meats, but for what they called morning restoration, meaning weak tea laced with a suspiciously generous shot of cognac. Tiny hangovers knew no age limit, and by the next afternoon, the house echoed with the telltale hush of the universally unwell. Adults napping in armchairs and children unusually quiet, all united by the universal principle that too much of a good thing applies regardless of height. It wasn't all raucous excess, but the Victorian tendency to toast every minor milestone: baby's first tooth, new teeth for the family dog, a cousin's miraculous avoidance of scarlet fever, meant that even the smallest gathering was an excuse to break out the spirits. No wonder many a diary entry ends with "a most agreeable evening, though my head aches still," a line equally true for mothers, maiden aunts, and small children alike. If you picture Victorian social life as a world of rigid etiquette and chilly reserve, it is professionally my duty to tell you to think again. Hidden among the relics of lace and porcelain are sticky cups, tipsy nursery rhymes, and the always present possibility of finding your infant sprawled contentedly among the overcoats. These parties were a heady blend of tradition and improvisation, of gleeful excess and morning regret. That, in the end, might be the most Victorian thing of all. So, toast to the tiniest party-goers, whose first hangovers were communal, and whose memories, if they had any, were likely as fuzzy as the punch was strong. In the late 1800s, science swoops in like a buzzkill at a house party. Suddenly clean water is a thing and people realise maybe babies don't need an IPA to sleep at night. Cue outrage and mild confusion. The scene: a cosy London parlour, 1875. Nursing mothers glare suspiciously at their glasses of stout, while stern-faced grandmothers assure everyone that a little drop of whiskey in the milk never hurt anyone. Enter Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch, the party-crashing chemists, wielding microscopes instead of sherry glasses. They're not here for a drink. They're here to ruin everyone's fun with a little thing called germ theory. Germ theory was, at its core, the ultimate killjoy. It drew a very uncool line from dirty water, sticky hands, and neglected bedpans to things like cholera, tuberculosis, and infant death. Up until then, the favoured explanation for illness had been bad air and vague miasmas, so the idea that invisible creatures were the source of all this suffering had people clutching their pearls and their decanters. How dare these scientists suggest that the tap water might be more dangerous than a half pint of beer, as the news made the rounds via pamphlets, early medical journals, and the ever-reliable neighbourhood gossip. Households reacted with a blend of outrage, uncertainty, and muted terror. Was it possible that scrubbing hands before feeding the baby actually mattered? Should you stop lacing the baby bottle with port wine and instead boil it? And once you saw what grew under a microscope, would you ever trust the public well again? Midwives were flummoxed. Generations of women had sworn by inherited routines. Bathe the baby in gin for teething, whiskey rubs for teething pain, stout to build strong bones. Now, the experts said you could simply prevent disease with soap, water, and, gasp, restraint at the bottle. Some dismissed it as another fashionable mania, like phrenology or the bicycle craze. Others began clutching at disinfectant and clean cloths as if their lives depended on it, which, as it turned out, they did. Of course, not everyone welcomed the new gospel of hygiene. Old habits died hard, especially when the switch felt like a rebuke to your grandmother's carefully curated home remedies. There were parents who quietly, stubbornly, slipped rum into bottles, even as public health campaigners held up baby-sized coffins as cautionary tales. Some doctors, too, grumbled that all this fuss about germs was overblown. After all, hadn't they managed to survive childhood on a steady diet of filthy hands and lead paint? But the evidence stacked up. Infant mortality rates plummeted in communities that implemented new practices: boiling bottles, sterilizing milk, promoting hand washing before meals, and, here's the big one, putting away the booze when it came to baby care. The world grudgingly acknowledged that maybe, just maybe, the scientists had a point. Still, beneath all the newfangled caution, an undercurrent of nostalgia lingered. Old-timers reminisced about home-brewed cures and the good old days when a baby could teethe on a sugar-soaked rag dipped in brandy. Relinquishing these traditions felt not just like a loss of control, but a denial of family wisdom. Never mind if the wisdom also included a side of cholera. By the turn of the century, mothers' magazines and health pamphlets were packed with advice that would have made their great-grandmothers wince. Clean everything. Trust boiled water. For God's sake, put down the gin. It wasn't instant enlightenment, but one step at a time, public belief veered from every drop of alcohol is medicinal to the actual recipe for healthier children. Germ theory didn't just change how people thought about disease. It fundamentally redrew the boundaries of trust. In science, in tradition, and in the mysterious alchemy required to keep babies alive. The debate was far from over. But one thing was clear: Pasteur, Koch, and their microscopes had changed the party forever. Even after reformers shut down baby beer, the legend survives. Grandmas whisper about ale as a cure for everything, and some families just carry on the tradition in secret, insisting it never did us any harm. For many, the closure of baby beer was never the closing of a chapter, but the beginning of a folklore. Stories ripple through generations, told around kitchen tables and at family gatherings, where elders swap tales, each one adding a little flourish or detail to underscore their point. Some recall a nice little stout when teeth were coming in. Others joke about how the only thing to settle their baby's colic was a finger dipped in porter. The details shift, but the underlying message stays the same. Baby beer wasn't just a drink, it was an act of caring, passed down like a treasured recipe, or a piece of family silver. In some neighborhoods, the closure marked not relief, but skepticism. Doctors said it was bad for us, but wasn't everything according to someone, quipped one old-timer. For families with roots in the old country, handing a child a sip of diluted ale was as normal as dunking bread in soup. Even after the ban, some quietly found ways to keep the tradition alive. Just a thimbleful, just for sleep, became code, spoken with the sly confidence of someone who knows their own mind, regardless of what outsiders thought. Of course, not all legacies are warm or benign. Memories of sickly infants and tragic tales linger alongside the laughter. Family albums may have all but erased these darker corners, but public health warnings echo faintly in the background. It's easy to forget that the reformers weren't just busybodies. They were responding to genuine harm. Still, nostalgia has a way of blurring facts with sentiment. A dangerous habit, but a very human one. Some elders choose to recall how all the children turned out right as rain. Others quietly bury any recollections that don't fit the family narrative. Even today, the idea persists in corners of the internet and among certain circles that alcohol, in just the right dose, can be a cure-all. Message boards share recipes for teething solutions like Grandma used to make. New parents, exhausted and desperate, sometimes wonder aloud whether the old ways weren't so bad after all. A few clicks online reveal a heated debate. Tradition versus science. Folklore versus caution. Childcare experts repeat the statistics. Family members cite intuition. My mother did it, and so did hers. Are you saying we don't know anything? The persistence of these old wives' tales isn't just about stubbornness. It's about holding onto a sense of autonomy in a world that often feels dictated by experts and official rules. To trust in the wisdom of past generations is to find comfort in uncertainty. It's a type of rebellion, gentle but insistent. A way of saying our family's story matters too. But legacies are complicated. While the bottles of baby beer have vanished from corner shops and the advertisements are consigned to dusty archives, the debates live on in subtler forms. What counts as good parenting? How do we balance inherited wisdom with new information? Where do we draw the line between harmless tradition and genuine risk? So, as old wives' tales echo through the years, shaped and reshaped with each retelling, we find ourselves at a crossroads. Legacy is never static. It's a living, breathing thing, constantly negotiated by each new generation. The story of baby beer and its afterlife in memory and myth is a testament to the complicated ways we grapple with change. We inherit stories. We argue about them. We laugh and shudder and raise eyebrows. Sometimes we cling to the past for comfort, all the while peeking over our shoulders, half expecting a reformer to come knocking, half hoping one never does. In the end, perhaps the real legacy of baby beer isn't the drink itself, but the enduring human tendency to weave in stories, to remember selectively, and to search for meaning in the blurry space between past and progress. Fast forward to today, and you see the frantic Google searches. Is kombucha safe for babies? We might have swapped baby beer for organic smoothies, but the underlying confusion is just as strong. The echoes of our parenting past are everywhere. Sure, we no longer hand toddlers a tankard of hard cider to calm them before bed, but the landscape of parenting is still a wild thicket of contradictions and anxieties. Baby-led weaning has replaced mashed peas, and the 2-nap day schedule is outnumbered by Montessori floor beds and sleep consultants with Instagram sponsorships. The tools have changed, but the pressures and second-guessing are almost identical. Today, parenting experts are only a swipe away, which should be reassuring. But ask any parent cornered at a birthday party about sleep regressions, screen time, or whether oat milk will stunt a toddler's emotional growth, and you'll see the haunted look that says, I read 6 articles about this and still have no idea. The 19th century parent might have been perplexed by tepid barley water, but the contemporary parent, armed with YouTube deep dives and evidence-based blogs, faces a different kind of paralysis, an abundance of supposedly correct information, all contradicting each other. The old ghost of baby beer lingers. In fact, every generation seems convinced it is the very first to truly worry about what it's feeding its young. There's comfort in believing we're on the cutting edge, even if the dilemma is perennial. In place of baby beer, we have battles over formula versus breastfeeding, kale versus quinoa, homemade purees versus prepackaged pouches, and an endless parade of one weird trick guaranteed to fix whatever modern affliction the parenting zeitgeist has latched onto this week. Take, for example, the emergence of boutique parenting philosophies, attachment, gentle, free range, or something picked up from a $300 online seminar, all promising to produce perfect children, provided you immediately stop whatever you're currently doing. The stakes feel impossibly high. Is that mild colic? Or is it an early warning sign that your child's future college essay will begin? Despite my mother's grievous failures. If anything, the information age and its tidal wave of parenting advice has made parents more certain that one wrong decision could set off a butterfly effect, forever altering the trajectory of their child's life. Our ancestors just had to worry about smallpox and spoiled milk. We have to worry about gluten, blue light, and whether cocomelon is secretly rewiring our baby's brain. Of course, underneath the surface changes, the filters, the apps, the organic snacks packaged in non-toxic pouches, the core human experience of parenting is remarkably unchanged. There is, and always has been, an underlying ache. Am I doing this right? The methods evolve, and what's in vogue shifts, but the questioning remains. We might joke about baby beer, but the spirit of anxiety it represents is alive and well, haunting modern kitchens as parents measure out probiotic powders and triple-check the cider vinegar concentration in their toddler's salad dressing. And yet, maybe that's the point. Maybe the ghost of baby beer doesn't just remind us of how far we've come, but also of how little the fundamentals have shifted. There's comfort, oddly, in knowing that the whirlwind of advice, second-guessing, and whispered judgment from the next generation of grandparents is a tradition stretching back centuries. Perhaps 100 years from now, some harried future parent will stumble across a vintage kombucha starter and wonder, was this okay for babies in 2024? And the cycle will repeat, proof that while the props change, the play stays the same. In the end, whether it's baby beer or cold-pressed baby juice, the knowledge that nobody really has it all figured out may be the closest thing to universal advice we'll ever get. So, let's raise a glass, of oat milk or otherwise, to every parent muddling through, side by side with the ghosts of anxieties past. In the end, the greatest miracle is survival. If you made it through babyhood without cholera, rickets, or being adopted by a band of travelling pipe players, you owe it to luck, tough genes, and possibly a mild beer haze. Somewhere between put the baby in the open window for air and rub this questionable ointment on their gums, our ancestors navigated the minefield of child rearing with all the scientific rigour of a medieval cook guessing at which mushrooms were edible. The truth is, the real reason you're alive to read this now has almost nothing to do with finely honed methods or carefully developed wisdom. It has everything to do with dumb luck. No, really, just a persistent, stubborn streak of accidental fortune. Forget the images we have of stoic mothers with herbal poultices, and fathers who could identify a croup cough by the light of a flickering candle. Most parents were fumbling through the dark, betting that the neighbour's trick involving mustard plaster and a half shot of gin would work better than last week's. Wrap the baby in onions and hope. There were no parenting blogs, no how-to books with helpful infographics. There was only relentless trial and error, often with a heavy emphasis on the error. Many of the so-called remedies that kept children alive did so not because they worked, but because the children in question were simply too stubborn to die after being swaddled in cabbage and incentive whiskey. The rest, a grimly high number, succumbed because the coin flipped the other way. Luck, in all its blind, chaotic glory, was as much a fixture in the nursery as the rocking chair and the mop bucket. Let's not romanticize it. There wasn't a hidden wisdom in dousing toddlers in turpentine for ringworm or in stringing garlic over the crib to ward off evil. And, presumably, relatives with sensitive noses. Yet for every cockamamie method, there was at least one child who shrugged off fever, escaped the open well, or simply clung to life long enough to become old enough to blame their parents for their allergies. Whatever their methods, survival often depended on having just the right amount of ignorance to keep experimenting and just enough luck to avoid catastrophe. This precarious dance with disaster wasn't reserved for the working poor or the rural farmhouse. Wealthy families were often the worst offenders, privileged enough to afford the latest Parisian baby soother made of lead and asbestos, or have a well-meaning but utterly baffled wet nurse imported from a town that didn't even have a word for sanitation. Some babies survived because their families, by sheer fortune, avoided fashion's deadliest trends. Others because their immune systems, like their parents' convictions, were inexplicably robust. Folklore and family legend. Remember when your great-uncle was nearly swept away by geese? Or, we used to let babies teethe on flattened coins for the iron. Reveal how hazard and hilarity went hand in hand. Survival stories become family treasures, tales of narrow escapes, embellished at every holiday table. Not because they're models for imitation, but because everyone realizes that, statistically, we probably shouldn't be here. The miracle isn't that our ancestors outsmarted fate, it's that they so often outlasted it. So the next time you hear someone extolling the virtues of the old ways, remember, the old ways included a lot of crossing fingers, knocking on wood, and hoping the wind was blowing in a direction that wouldn't kill the baby. The real hero of your lineage isn't a wise midwife or a brave pioneer. It's capricious chance, serendipity in soiled linen, the defiant flutter of a small heart that refused to quit, and perhaps just a dash of stout. So tonight, as you snuggle down into a mattress that doesn't smell like a brewery or double as a family heirloom, think kindly of your ancestors, their creative attempts at parenting, their total disregard for modern health code violations, and their unstoppable determination to raise the next generation, hiccups and all. Because history isn't just a cautionary tale, it's a living tribute to the human ability to adapt, survive, and occasionally invent some very questionable cocktails for children. Monster under the bed. That's nothing compared to mid-century tap water, or your teething ring soaked in stout. So relax, drift off, and let the gentle hum of your fan take you somewhere safe. Far away from the sound of drunken roosters, and even farther from a midnight infant fortification. Sleep well, and toast quietly to the weird, wonderful families who got you here. So tonight, as you snuggle down into a mattress that doesn't smell like a brewery or double as a family heirloom, think kindly of your ancestors, their creative attempts at parenting, their total disregard for modern health code violations, and their unstoppable determination to raise the next generation, hiccups and all. Because history isn't just a cautionary tale, it's a living tribute to the human ability to adapt, survive, and occasionally invent some very questionable cocktails for children. Monster under the bed? That's nothing compared to mid-century tap water or your teething ring soaked in stout. So relax, drift off, and let the gentle hum of your fan take you somewhere safe. Far away from the sound of drunken roosters. And even farther from a midnight infant fortification. Sleep well and toast quietly to the weird, wonderful families who got you here.